So aloha everyone, my name is Julia Wicklin and I'm the moderator for this session titled Cost-Effective Erosion and Sediment Control Design. Please use the Q&A section during this session to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a few minutes for the speaker to answer your questions. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speaker for our session. Richard Price is a professional engineer with over 25 years experience in stormwater and sustainability design and implementation. Richard currently works at EA Engineering and in EA's Pacific Rim Sustainability and Stormwater Program Manager, serving clients up and down the West Coast and around the Pacific Rim. He has worked with the Department of Transportation for over 10 years, supporting the municipal stormwater permit compliance program. His experience includes erosion and sediment control, stormwater treatment design and LID project development, as well as climate change and sea level rise risk assessment and mitigation strategy development. Richard is an APWA certified stormwater manager, a SISEC certified inspector of sediment and erosion control, and a California qualified industrial stormwater practitioner. Please help me today in welcoming Richard Price. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. I don't know if I drew the short straw or whether they think that much of me, but they put me opposite the DOH folks that typically everyone wants to go see. So I'm just going to take it as a compliment and go from there. It looks like we have a great crowd, so I appreciate you all being here. Let's see. There we go. So quick agenda. I'll do brief introductions. We'll talk a little bit about the background and history of the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. I'll touch on the erosion and sediment control plans that are typically in your part of your design package in a bid package. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about the SWPPP and then close it up and try and save some time at the end for questions. If you have questions as we're going along, you can type them into the question box. And then Julia will have the list for us at the end. So introduction about me. I think Julia just read all my credentials to you. I spent 2 years in Hawaii when we started the Oahu Stormwater Management Program in 2009 and 2010. I guess I was there. And since then I've been back and forth. I'm now based in Seattle. I have been working managing stormwater permit compliance programs since 2002, all across the country. And you have my email address there. If you ever need to get in contact with me, please reach out. So I have to admit, I'm new at presenting these virtual conferences. This is typically the point where I ask you all to raise your hand as I ask you. So I'm going to do this a little bit different, and I'm going to make a guess. And I'm going to assume we've got quite a good group of consultants in the room, a number of whom are going to be designers that design stormwater plans or design road projects that have stormwater components. I'm going to assume we have some construction inspectors. I'm hoping we have some contractors and contractor staff who actually build some of these projects, possibly some regulators, but they may all be over on the DOH presentation, and maybe just some other random consultants that are working supporting the stormwater program. And did I miss anyone? Raise your hand if I missed you. Okay, well, I'll take that as an all-inclusive maybe. And as for your stormwater background, again, I'm assuming you all at least work or have an interest or some connection, a nexus to this stormwater program. And then rather than asking you what you want to learn from the class, I'm going to tell you what I hope to bring you is sort of a little bit different perspective on your stormwater pollution prevention plan and the importance of integrating that with the contract documents, with the entire team that's producing the project, and hopefully looking at ways that we can streamline our SWPs and save money, because that's really what the bottom line is always about. So you can test me on that at the end with your questions and see how we do. So I just thought I'd start out and introduce the EPA has a good guidance document. I believe it came out in 2015 or 16, developing your stormwater pollution prevention plan. And they kind of go through step by step, getting started on developing your plan, selecting your BMPs, implementation, inspection and maintenance. And this plan is available on the stormwaterhawaii.com website. So it's a good guidance for you to use, and I'm going to follow through some of the steps in this today when we talk more about it in a little bit. So moving on to sort of the history and background of our SWPPs. What is a SWPP? Well, it kind of says it right in the name. It's a plan to prevent stormwater pollution. In simplest terms, that's what we're doing. This plan needs to be signed by a company executive. Typically, that's the construction contractor. That's an important point there, because it does, the construction general permit is a federally mandated permit under the Clean Water Act and has mandatory penalties associated with noncompliance, and particularly for intentional noncompliance. And so if you, or in more cases, it's your boss is signing this plan because you told him it's good to go, they are personally liable, and the company is liable for what's in that plan. So it is something to take seriously. But as to the nuts and bolts, your SWPP is going to identify what you're doing in your project, what materials are you handling, or what construction activities are going to create conditions that could cause stormwater pollution. And then it's going to detail how we're going to prevent and minimize discharges from our site during the project. And in simplest terms, that's what your SWPP is. The level of detail in the SWPP can vary from, I've seen simple projects with just a few pages of description and a hand-drawn site map. And I've seen larger projects that may have, multiple 6, 8, 10 different phases that have a separate set of drawings for each one to show the stormwater BMPs that will be in place during each phase. And, generally speaking, the larger the land disturbance, the more complicated, the steeper the slopes, the more issues you have to deal with. Are you discharging to a TMDL waterway or other sensitive habitat, wetlands, that kind of thing? How close are you to your neighbors? Everyone's always interested when you start working in front of their house. And I like the last one about high value properties, because we always know that the richer your neighbors are, the more interested they are in what you're doing. So I'll apologize in advance for launching into a Christmas theme here, but I'll give you a quick aside. Every year, right around November the 1st, I see my first red Starbucks cup, and my immediate reaction is, oh my God, the commercialization of Christmas, they've got to stop this. And then I remember that my favorite beer of the year, the Sierra Nevada Celebration Ale, comes out about then. And I quit complaining and immediately make a beeline for the store to see if I can find some Celebration Ale. So let's, we all have our own constraints on this, but following the Christmas carols guidelines, the ghost of construction past, when it came to stormwater controls, we use silt fence, and we use silt fence and we use silt fence. And if you were a contractor and you're bidding a job, you would do a quick calculation of the perimeter of the site and look at the cost of silt fence and round it up. And on the bid sheet, on the line for erosion and sediment control, you'd put a lump sum of $2,000 or $5,000. And that was the end of the story. When we come to the ghost of construction present, we now have a system where we have an approved SWIP. So typically the contractor needs to bid the job and put a cost in there. And only after he wins it, do you then get tasked with developing a SWIP and submitting it for review and approval. And you don't really always know exactly what they're going to ask of you in getting that SWIP approved. And the transition from the past to the present was difficult, or was compounded by our history of just putting a lump sum of $5,000 on a project, because contractors would still bid that way. And then when it came time to telling them what they needed in their SWIP and how they need to implement it and the amount of inspections and maintenance they need to do, we ran out of money and came into conflict with this. And we've worked through that, and I think we've come to a good place now. So we have a program where there's a SWIP on every project. There are a wide variety of BMPs available. If we were all sitting in a nice conference room together, I'd tell you, when you go outside, talk to the vendors, and they've got something new that you haven't seen before, because every year they've got something new coming out. There's a continuing innovation of stormwater BMPs available to you. And overall, it's a great improvement. I mean, I think there's much less pollutant coming off of construction sites, but there's still room for improvement. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, as I mentioned, in sort of the costing and what's expected of you. And then the ghost of Christmas future, I'll say that in a number of states in the mainland, they now have a requirement that the designer prepares an erosion and sediment control plan, and it's part of the sealed construction documents and part of the bid package. And the contractor's means and methods don't really come into this. They're pretty much prescribing to you what BMPs you're going to use, how you're going to use them. And, you know, maybe this is better. It's easier for the contractor to bid because they can see exactly what they're going to have to do. But there's no flexibility. There's potentially higher cost to the owner. And I think there's still maybe a better way to go about this. So I don't want to see Hawaii go here. But it is the wave of the future in many places. So let's talk a little more about erosion and sediment control plans and what's included in design documents. I mean, typically your erosion and sediment control plans are guidelines, expectations, maybe timing and construction sequencing for a project. These can be not necessarily a completely prescriptive, thou shalt do this, but they can be recommendations to the contractor, or it can be a partial set of BMPs that are going to be required for the project because maybe the owner and the designer have specific concerns about a TMDL waterway that you're discharging to, or a specific sensitive area, a wetland or something, or one of those nosy neighbors, I mean, whatever it might be. Another thing that I see in here, what I call dual use BMPs. A lot of designers are laying out sites now, if they are putting in a permanent best management practice, such as a rain garden or a pond or a detention basin, they will try and route all of the construction stormwater to that location. and initially build a sediment trap or a sediment basin that will allow you to use that location and that footprint for sediment control during construction, and then wait until the end of the project to convert that sediment basin to a pond or an infiltration B&P like a rain garden. One of the advantages that I always see in this is that I'm constantly struggling with designing and trying to get the contractor to build infiltration B&Ps like rain gardens without building them and using the rain garden to control construction stormwater and putting a lot of sediment into those soils that are designed to infiltrate. So by waiting until the very end, once the site is stabilized and then building your infiltration B&Ps, you avoid any potential for construction input to it. So always a possibility. Another aspect of this that I strongly recommend for owners and designers to push forward is a constructability review. And it's an opportunity to incorporate the contractor's means and methods into maybe the design. I'm an engineer, so I'll be happy to tell you that the engineers always know best, but sometimes the people that actually build these things can give you more input on things like the construction sequencing, how to lay out the plans, and where you might want to put a rain garden so that you could also use it as a sediment trap, for example. So I'm a strong proponent of this. The next step that I see is when we go to bid the job, it's important when we have a pre-bid meeting that we include all of the right people, the designer, the contractors, field engineers and inspectors, but also that we incorporate the stormwater controls, both construction B&Ps and permanent B&Ps if we have them on the project, as topics to be included in the pre-bid meeting and discussion, to make it clear what the expectations are for the contractor on a given project, so that they have a clear idea of what they should put in that erosion and sediment control bid line, and don't come back later asking for more money because they say they didn't understand it. It's a good opportunity to make sure everyone understands what it is that you're building and what their role is, not only on the construction side, but on the stormwater management side. So let's move into the meat of this and talk a little bit about your SWPPP. Uh-oh, did I lose it?
I think we lost your screen share. Oh, here we go.
No, that's not. Okay, I hit the wrong button. Okay, so talking about your SWPPP, I apologize for that. I told you I wasn't very good at this. So, what is your plan, right? You've just won a construction contract with the DOT. You are setting out to get started work. So the first thing you've got to do is, darn it, we've got to write this SWPPP and get it done. And obviously you have to do it to comply with the regulations. You have to do it to get your permits done so you can speed up in TP and get started. And the impetus is always to, let's do this as fast as we can and get this over with. But I think it's worth spending the time to think a little bit about how the SWPPP is going to interact with your construction activities, and potentially how can we design the SWPPP so that it can save us money down the road as we build the project. And for this next section, again, I'm going back to our EPA guidance document, the Developing Your Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, and they line out 10 primary principles, and I'm going to go through these one by one and just talk a little bit about how you can incorporate it into your construction planning, and also, have potentially how they might be able to save you money. So principle number one, minimize disturbed area and protect natural features and soil. Seems obvious, but you get a set of plans and they show you the limit of disturbance. And so you immediately go out and survey it and mark that off and clear and grub the entire area. But if you stop and look at it, it may be that you don't actually have to clear all of that. There may be specific areas that can be minimized, like laydown areas. There may be sections of it where you have sensitive features like a stream, or even just a natural drainage, a gully or drainage area, and leaving a buffer of vegetation along those provides you an extra level of BMP, an extra level of filtration of water that's discharging there. This can, if you can reduce your area of disturbance, by definition, you're going to reduce the amount of sediment you can potentially generate. You're going to reduce the number and variety maybe of BMPs that you have to install. And all of these things can save you money. The second principle that they come to is phased construction activity. And I will touch on this one over and over again. I don't know how many of you saw Barry Fagan's presentation on innovative BMPs in transportation projects in Alabama from the Alabama DOT earlier this morning. I see at least one hand raised. An excellent presentation. If you didn't see it, I would strongly recommend. I'm assuming that all of these are going to be available for you to watch the recorded sessions. I would strongly recommend you go back and watch it. He had some really good ideas on, in fact, theirs was a continually phased project where they only disturbed 35 feet of work at a time and closed it up every day as they went forward to avoid any kind of sediment discharge from the site. But maybe not going to that extreme, but by breaking your project into phases, you can minimize the amount of disturbed area that you have, exposed soil. Again, with some of the newer BMPs that are available, like some of the compost socks and things like that, that can be reused, you may be able to reduce the amount of BMPs that you buy, use them on that first section, and then move them to the next section. You're reducing cost on materials, on labor, on inspection, and then obviously on maintenance. If you've got a 6-mile road to work on and you put up 6 miles of silt fence today, 2 weeks from now, if you go back and inspect it, what are the chances that some section of it hadn't been knocked down by something and you've got to go back, send somebody out there and put it back up? So the more you can do, there's also reduced risk. I've worked on enough jobs where you clear and grub and expose a huge area of soil, and then suddenly the weather forecast changes and you get 4 inches of rain 2 days later. And you've got a sediment plume leaving your site. You've got everyone on your back. You're sending people out on overtime to try and fix your BMPs. So you're reducing the risk of an adverse event considerably. And again, a great potential to save money. There's a little more thought and planning that goes into this because you need to have that phase construction thought out ahead of time. And then you need to work with whoever's developing your SWPPP, whether it's one of your staff or a consultant, and make sure they understand your construction phasing and that they can phase the SWPPP accordingly so that you don't have to go back and revisit and revise your SWPPP continually because you already have it. Phase 1, this is what it's going to look like. Phase 2. So you may spend a little bit more money on your SWPPP, but it'll save you money and reduce risk in the long run. The EPA's principle number 3, control stormwater flowing onto and through your project. This is a huge one. This is one that I think I have struggled with more than any other in my career. And it seems simple, you know, we don't want water flowing from offsite into our project, but typically Mother Nature, topography, and property boundaries will all conspire against you and make it difficult to do this. But to the largest extent you can, if you can collect water from uphill of your project and divert it around your project in clean, stabilized conveyance like a ditch or a berm, you don't have to worry about that water. You don't have to treat that water. You know, again, you may need some BMPs in your diversion ditch itself to make sure that it's not causing erosion. But by diverting that water around your site, you eliminate your liability and your concern and the money that you would spend treating and managing and repairing your site where it gets washed out by all that water in a large rainstorm. Again, there's a lot of options on phase construction here, because there may be that you can divert the water for the first 2 phases of your work, and then at the end you're stuck with it because you've got to regrade the site and do your final grading and stabilization, and you've got to live with it at the end. But it can be a big cost saver, and again, it's a liability reduction throughout the course of the project. And I'll show you an example of a project I'm working on right now, where the designer gave us their erosion and sediment control plans, and we're supposed to prepare the SWPPP to complete this. And there's a section of road here, and they put in, you see the red lines kind of highlighting where the ditches are going to be on the side of the road. They put in some temporary berms to collect all the water, or berms or swales to collect all the stormwater on site. And you can kind of see the little boxes across there, which are check dams as water flows down, so that we're getting some, you know, some energy dissipation as the water flows down the hill. And this all looks fine until you, and again, the way the project is drawn, you can't really see this, but until you draw back and look at it, there's a huge hill above the project, and there are several acres of land draining down into the project. And so you have water flowing down into the project, and you can see this upper dashed line is the limits of construction. And then this next dashed line is the grading limits. So you have all this offsite water flowing into your disturbed soil inside the grading limits, and then into the swale. So by the time it gets to the swale, it's already yours. You own it, and it's probably carrying sediment that it picked up, because there's a huge volume of water coming across your disturbed soil and into that swale. And you know, one of the obvious ideas here would be to construct a swale at the limits of construction to collect all this clean water and transport it down to the bottom of the project, and avoid taking all this clean water and dumping it on your exposed dirt and creating sediment laden water. Again, can save you money in a number of ways by not having to treat all that, and also go back and rework all that soil that gets rilled up and eroded. So their principle number 4, stabilize soils promptly. Again, this is a lot about project phasing. If you can work the soil, get your final grading in place, seed it, and if it's on a steep slope, put down your matting, and reach final stabilization, you're done. You can mark that section of the project off of your SWPPP, and you no longer need to do inspections there. You no longer need to concerned about BMPs there, that area of the project is done. So obviously it can be a big money saver. Again, it takes a little more thought and planning and phasing of your project, but in the end, it can be a huge savings. And part of this is just housekeeping, as realizing where you're done and where you're not, and cleaning up your work and moving on. Principle number 5 is protect slopes. Obviously, the steeper and longer slopes, you end up with more complex erosion and sediment control. There's potential money savings on BMP selection. If you have a big slope and you have to cut it and grade it, and you're not able to stabilize it immediately, you could throw a little bit of grass seed on it and say you stabilized it, or maybe get some of the cheapest mesh matting you could find and put over it. And what typically happens is, by the end of the project, you've had water run down that hill, you've got rilling and gullies and erosion, and you end up having to go back and bring your crew back and regrade that slope and restabilize it, and then you can seed it and do your final stabilization. So if you can get that slope in place, maybe spend a little more money on one of the higher quality, the thicker, heavier duty mattings, but grade it, seed it, put the matting down, and then spend the time and attention to water it and irrigate that grass so you get it a good start on it. Boom, you're done. That's stabilized and you're ready to move forward. Principle 6, protecting storm drain inlets. This is a hard one to save money on. These are problematic no matter what you do. There's tend to be a lot of them. They're maintenance intensive. People tend to run over whatever you put there. So you might put some thought into BMP selection depending on the type of site and the traffic, but I don't have a lot of good suggestions there. Principle 7, perimeter controls. I'll say silt fence. There are some newer options to silt fence that may be appropriate depending on your site. Some of which are reusable, don't require as much labor to trench in. Obviously, all that trenching and backfilling, you're disturbing more soil that you potentially have to control. So could be some savings there. But again, I come back to phasing and trying to minimize the length of perimeter control that you have in place that you're inspecting and maintaining at any given time. Principle 8, retaining sediment on site. This is sediment traps and basins. We don't use these a lot in Hawaii. I think there may be more opportunities for it, but we're, typically driven here by space as much as anything, particularly on linear projects like highways. But these are good opportunities for what I was calling the dual use BMPs. If you're going to put in a permanent BMP, you may be able to utilize that space for a sediment trap during construction, and then save the construction of your permanent BMP for the end of the project. I don't know if you travel on the mainland and you're like me, you travel and you find yourself looking at stormwater controls while you're supposed to be on vacation. A lot of places in the mainland, you'll see the interstate has cloverleaf interchanges, and the inside of that cloverleaf will have a stormwater pond in it. So it's, there is space. And I know in Honolulu, the DOT Highways has put a bioswale in the university interchange on H1. Again, taking advantage of that space that's available and using it. So sometimes, put some thought into those. You may be able to make double use of some of those spaces. Principle 9, stabilize construction exits. Now, I don't know about you, but my whole career, I was taught to call these stabilized construction entrances. And of course, I don't think we're ever worried about vehicles coming onto our site and bringing sediment into our construction site. So I like the name. It's just going to take me a long time to remember to say it correctly. Again, here, stabilized construction exits they're expensive. They're hard to maintain. So I don't have a lot of good options for you. Some of it can be sort of phasing and site layout. Is it possible to, change your access road routing a little bit so that you can have, fewer entrances, particularly on a linear project? There are some really nice wheel wash systems out there now, and you may find, depending on the size and the duration and the amount of traffic at your site, that having a wheel wash in front of your stabilized construction exit can avoid getting a lot of that sediment into the gravel that then causes you to have to dig it all out and replace it. And I know space is always a confining factor on these as well. But I think there is some potential to look at that. And then principle 10 is inspection and maintenance controls. And I will say maintenance, 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 because when we typically bid these jobs, we will, again, measure the perimeter, look at the cost of silt fence to install the silt fence, and boom, there's our cost. But often over the course of a project that lasts for, many weeks or months, or sometimes even multiple years, the maintenance of that silt fence can far exceed the cost of what you initially put in there. So putting a little thought into what you're putting in, how long is it going to be there? What am I going to have to do to, maintain this, clean the sediment that collects there, and how might I do this better? Are there ways to minimize the actual erosion so we don't have as much sediment to manage? Can be a huge money saver over the course of a project. And then the EPA document outlines a whole bunch of other controls that may or may not be appropriate for a particular site. But obviously, I think you've all heard of, surface roughening and track walking for slope stabilization. There's a lot of interesting work being done on soil bioengineering, and especially using live stakes. I know you've all seen the compost berm. They have it listed below in sediment control, but a lot of places are using those compost berms and putting seed inside the berm. So you lay out these berms or stake them out on your hill slope for temporary erosion control. The materials in it are all degradable. It will start sprouting and the grass growing, and you pretty soon have permanent stabilization there, without having to ever deal with removing your BMPs. So again, there may be a cost saving in the long run by spending a little more money up front with some of these other ideas. And I'll leave you to go back through the manual and check out some of the other ideas. And then I want to touch briefly on, implementing your SWIP. Again, you finally get your permit approved, you've got your SWIP. What do? You call your site manager and he goes out and clears and grubs the site. Sometimes it's worth putting a little thought in before construction. There is training required by the permit, but there's also maybe some more thought you might want to give making sure all of your staff know what they're supposed to do and that they're all responsible for this, rather than having one guy who's the stormwater guy and nobody else on site knows or cares or is doing anything to help. If you make this a shared responsibility of everyone in the organization, you can minimize some of the digressions that end up, causing problems that end up creating additional work later. And also under responsibility of subcontractor flow down, make sure that your contract documents with your subcontractors flow down whatever requirements the owner has put on you, but also whatever requirements the permit is requiring and your SWIP requires that those subcontractors are going to need to comply with. Implement your SWIP before construction. Make sure you have your controls in place before you clean and clear and grub. Get the perimeter controls out there. Your process for inspections, and then corrective actions when you do your inspections. And then at the end of the project, is your SWIP working for you? You you need to constantly sort of evaluate and reevaluate your SWPPP. And do we need to add BMPs? Do we need to change the SWPPP? You may save yourself headaches later by stopping now and fixing it once you realize that one of your BMPs is not working. And then final stabilization and permanent termination. You know, we all dream of that NOT. And final stabilization, 9 times out of 10, we come down to trying to get the damn grass to grow. And what is 70%? Stable 70% germination. You know, I know we're engineers and we're contractors and we like to pour concrete and build roads and build things, but the vegetated portions of our projects are equally important. And quite honestly, it's not that difficult to grow grass. The trick is that you make the soil amendments you need, you get the seed in there, and then you pay a little attention to it for those first couple of weeks to make sure it gets the water it needs to germinate and get established and get the roots down far enough that you don't dry out a germinated seed and kill it. Because as I'm sure you've all seen before, after you seed and mat and plan out and think you finish your project, and then the grass doesn't grow, going back and trying to re-scarify the soil and reseed and get it all back into shape, maybe repair some erosion that's happened, can be a huge cost. So taking the time to grow the grass right can save you a lot of trouble in the end. And then finally is the site cleanup and BMP removal once you have the grass. And then documentation and record retention. You want to, obviously, all the way through, you've documented everything. Keep those records in case there's questions down the road from somebody. And then, you know, I'm very big on lessons learned. You know, at the end of a project, did your SWPPP work for you? What didn't work the way you would have liked, and what would you change if you had to do it again? And how can you learn from this for your next project going forward? So before I take your questions, I'll leave you with a couple of questions to think about. You know, what creative ideas can you come up with in the future to make this all work better so that we can do a better job of controlling stormwater from our construction sites and save money doing it, so that we make our boss happy, we make our family happy, and we keep Hawaii beautiful? So that's just a thought for all of you. And I think, you know, my answer would be that it all comes down to working as a team, so that everyone on the project, from the owner to the designer to the contractor to the subcontractors, are all working towards the same goal. And then I think it's actually an easy process when we make it a part of the construction instead of an add-on that it's just a problem we have to deal with. And Julia, with that, I think I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Richard, for the presentation. So we're now going to go into the question and answer section of this session. If anybody has a question for Richard, please type it into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Richard, we did get a question early on, so I'll read that one. It's from Kevin Sato. By prescribing BMPs, does the liability fall on the government?
That's a very good question. And again, I would recommend you go back to Barry's presentation from this morning, because he addressed that as well. The liability does go back on the owner. And in states like Maryland and Virginia, where they actually include the erosion and sediment control plans in the design, the owner then puts it back on the designer. And so there is potentially more cost for you, but there is also more control of making sure things are done correctly, and that you don't end up hiring a contractor that goes out there and exposes 6 acres of soil and then doesn't have proper controls in place and and doesn't maintain them and creates what then becomes a liability for the state, because you're the one that's polluting, even though the contractor holds the permit. You know, the TV station is going to be coming to you asking questions.
Thank you, Richard. We'll wait a little bit more for some more
Okay.
questions.
While we're waiting, in fact, I was intrigued enough. I stole a couple of screenshots. I think I put them in here. Hang on a second. If I can make my computer work, from Barry's presentation this morning. And you'll see right there, that was the first question he addressed. We can't dictate contractors' means and methods. And, you know, yes, you can, but you do take on a little more responsibility. But then again, you also have the control and the expertise. One of the other questions that he entertained was, did that slow down production? You know, do you slow down the project by telling them to phase it, for instance? And you may, or you may not, because if you have this huge exposed area and you get a big rainfall, then you have a big mud pit, you have repairs that need to be made before they can even get back to construction. So it can actually increase productivity. And then he kind of waffled on the cost. There obviously are costs, but they said that they also finished the job earlier than anticipated, which saved money on other things. So those were the questions he addressed on some of these same issues. Julia, did you see any other questions come in?
There's one more came in, but it isn't finished. I think they forgot to type the rest of the question, or it might have been answered already and they realized that. Can wait another minute, see if anybody has, oh, here we go. So the question is, oftentimes approach projects plans include BMPs/environmental controls sheet. How much responsibility falls on the contractor versus the engineer of the record versus the owner if the actual implementation is altered or modified to meet the actual field conditions/situations?
That's an excellent question. And it's one I'm dealing with right now in that example I showed you of the road with the ditches along the side, because I'm now being asked to modify that plan. As a designer, if I'm not being asked to provide a complete erosion and sediment control plan for the entire site and construction, I would typically provide a note that these are guidance or for recommendation or for you know, for use by the contractor, but not as a prescribed design to be followed. And I argue this with some of the folks in my company often, because they're like, but you're signing and stamping those. And I'm always trying to remind them, as a licensed engineer, if I draw you a picture of how to build your house on a napkin in a bar, I can be taken to court because that's an engineering drawing that I provided to you. And you don't have to sign and stamp it to be liable for the design that you provide. So by providing that disclaimer on there, if it's not there, then it does get a little bit concerning in how you would modify those plans and who takes responsibility.
Thank you, Richard. So I think it is time to break for lunch. So we'll have to close the question and answer portion for this session. Thank you again, Richard. That concludes the session. And thank you guys all for attending.
And thanks everyone
for lunch.
I appreciate it.
The next sessions begin at 1 p.m. and the vendors will be around during the break if you would like to chat with them. And if you've experienced any technical difficulties thus far and need assistance, please visit the info desk to chat with a representative. We will see you after lunch. Thank you.